This is the story of a small town cinema that at one point was the center of life in the community. Every weekend, the theater would be full of people, families, and groups of friends coming to watch the latest films. It was a lively place where everyone gathered, laughing and sharing popcorn. But one day, things started to change. One by one, the crowds began to disappear, and soon the cinema became almost completely abandoned. There were rumors swirling around the town about the strange happenings inside the cinema, but no one dared to speak too openly about it. People avoided the theater, and it sat alone in the dark corner of the town, with only Mr. Reed, the elderly owner, left to care for it. Mr. Reed, who had run the cinema for decades, became more and more withdrawn as time went on. He began to act strangely, staring at the empty rows of seats with an unsettling look on his face. The town whispered that something was wrong with the cinema, but no one could quite figure out what. Mr. Reed would often mention hearing strange noises at night, faint whispers and the sound of footsteps, even though no one was there. He seemed to be waiting for something, but no one knew what. One day, Mr. Reed received a mysterious package in the mail. There was no return address, just a plain brown envelope with a VHS tape inside. There was no label on the tape, just a note that read, "Watch it, and you'll know the truth." At first, Mr. Reed was hesitant. Who would send him something like this? But his curiosity got the better of him, and one evening, he decided to play the tape on the old VCR in the back office. When the screen flickered to life, he was immediately struck by how strange the film was. It was in black and white, grainy and old, but there was something haunting about it. The opening scene showed a nearly empty cinema, with rows upon rows of seats, but no audience. The camera panned across the room, revealing several people sitting in the seats, but their faces were blank and motionless. They were staring at the screen as if they were hypnotized, not moving at all. The silence in the room was deafening, and Mr. Reed could feel an unease creeping up his spine. At first, Mr. Reed thought it was just a weird, artsy film. But the longer he watched, the more he felt that something wasn't right. The people in the film began to slowly turn their heads toward the camera, and their expressions never changed. It was like they were staring straight at him, and that made his skin crawl. As the film continued, the figures began to rise from their seats, moving toward the screen, as though they were following a command. After watching the film, Mr. Reed couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, the cinema remained completely empty. There were no visitors, no laughter, no chatter. The place that used to be full of life was now eerily quiet. For days, no one came in to watch a movie, not even the regulars. Mr. Reed couldn't understand why. And that's when the whispers began. People in town started talking about strange things happening at the cinema at night. Some claimed they could hear footsteps echoing through the empty theater, while others said they could feel an unsettling presence if they passed by after dark. But no one dared go near the cinema, not after what had happened to it. It wasn't long before the town grew quiet about the cinema altogether, but the rumors continued. They said Mr. Reed had started acting more and more like one of the people in the film, sitting by the door, staring out at nothing. He had become a shell of the man he used to be, and no one could figure out what had really happened. Then one night, a group of teenagers, eager to uncover the truth, decided to break into the cinema. They had heard the stories, but they didn't believe them. They thought they were just some crazy old tales to spook people, but what they were about to find out would change everything. The group of teenagers, eager to uncover the truth about the mysterious happenings at the cinema, decided to break in one night. They had heard the rumors, but to them, it all seemed like just exaggerated stories. A mix of thrill-seeking and the desire to prove the town's superstitions wrong motivated them to sneak into the cinema after dark. The teenagers, 4 in total, crept through the back entrance, careful not to be seen. The town had long stopped talking about the cinema, and the cinema itself seemed like a forgotten relic, but curiosity burned in the hearts of the teens. As they stepped into the cinema, an immediate sense of unease swept over them. The place that had once been full of life now felt cold and abandoned. The walls, once vibrant with advertisements and movie posters, were now peeling, and the air was thick with dust. The seats, which had once been occupied by people laughing and chatting, were now arranged neatly in perfect rows. There was a strange emptiness in the air, like something was watching them, but they couldn't quite place it. The teenagers tried to brush off the chill they felt and made their way toward the front of the theater. Ben, the leader of the group, was the first to suggest they watch the mysterious VHS tape that had been found in Mr. Reed's office. "Let's just play it and see what happens. Maybe it's all just a stupid prank," he said with a nervous laugh, trying to hide the anxiety creeping into his voice. The others agreed, though they didn't know what they were getting into. They sat in the back row, the seats creaking under their weight. The room was completely dark, the only light coming from the flickering VCR. They inserted the tape and pressed play. The screen came to life with grainy black and white footage, showing a nearly empty cinema, just like the one they were sitting in. At first, everything seemed normal, but as the film continued, things started to feel strange. The figures on the screen, who appeared to be watching a movie, didn't move at all. They simply sat in place, their eyes fixed on the screen in front of them. Their faces were blank, lifeless, and their bodies stiff. As the film continued, something even more unsettling began to happen. The people in the movie slowly turned their heads toward the camera, and their eyes met the eyes of the teenagers in the back row. It was as if the people on the screen could see them, could feel their presence in the cinema. The teens felt a chill run down their spines, and some of them instinctively shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But they couldn't stop watching. The figures on the screen rose from their seats, one by one, and began to move toward the camera. The movement was slow, deliberate, like they were being drawn to something, and it felt unnatural. Just when Ben was about to turn off the VCR, the screen flickered and the film cut to black. The teenagers were left in the silence of the cinema, unsure of what had just happened. Before they could say anything, the screen came back to life, but now it wasn't showing the same film. The scene on the screen was different. Now it was showing them. The teenagers. Their faces were distorted, twisted, staring back at them with hollow eyes. The room seemed to get colder as their own voices echoed from the speakers, but they hadn't spoken. It was as if the film was mocking them, making them hear things that weren't happening. The terror was building. One of the girls, Lisa, began to panic. She reached for the remote, but her hands were trembling too much to press any buttons. The others were frozen in place, too scared to move. Then, without warning, the figures from the film appeared in the cinema itself, walking down the aisles toward them. They were no longer just faces on the screen. They were real, and they were coming for the teens. The figures' eyes never left the teenagers, and their faces remained emotionless, their movements stiff, like they were being controlled by some unseen force. The teenagers couldn't look away, their bodies frozen in place. They wanted to run, but it was as if the air around them had thickened, trapping them in their seats. In the midst of the chaos, Lisa tried to scream, but no sound came out. The terror they felt wasn't just in the air, it was in their very bones. The figures moved closer, and the teens began to realize that they weren't just in danger. They were part of the film now. They were trapped, caught in a nightmare they couldn't escape. One of the figures, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes, reached out toward Lisa. His fingers were cold, and his touch sent a shock of ice through her body. She felt as if she was being dragged toward the screen, her body resisting but unable to break free. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Mr. Reed. He looked different. Pale, worn out, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He rushed toward the teens, shouting at them to run. But it was too late. The figures were already too close, and the screen seemed to pulsate with an evil energy. Mr. Reed reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, old book. "You have to leave now. The cinema feeds on fear. It will take you if you stay," he shouted. But even as he spoke, the figures closed in, and the air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. The teens knew their only chance was to escape. The moment Mr. Reed appeared at the door, the atmosphere inside the cinema shifted. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, as if time itself had frozen in place. The figures who had been slowly advancing toward the teenagers stopped and turned their attention to Mr. Reed. His presence seemed to have some power over them, but it was unclear whether he was their ally or another victim of the cursed cinema. The teens, still paralyzed by fear, barely registered his words at first. "You shouldn't have come here," Mr. Reed whispered, his voice trembling as he stepped further into the room. His face, pale and drawn, seemed to carry the weight of years of suffering. The figures continued to stare at the teens, their faces expressionless, as though they had been waiting for this moment. Mr. Reed glanced frantically at the teens. "It's too late for me," he said, his voice breaking, "but it's not too late for you. You have to get out now. The cinema. It's alive. It feeds on the souls of anyone who dares to enter. The film? It's cursed. It traps you. Once you've seen it, once you've interacted with it, you become a part of it." The teenagers were frozen in fear. They couldn't fully grasp the gravity of Mr. Reed's words, but the terror in his eyes told them that this was no ordinary warning. The air around them felt heavier, as though the cinema itself was closing in on them. The figures on the screen, still eerily motionless, began to move again, their feet dragging across the floor as they advanced toward the teens. The coldness in the room intensified, and the whispers that had been faint before grew louder, until it felt like a cacophony of voices echoing in their minds. Each word sent a chill down their spines, whispering terrible truths about the cinema's curse. Desperation set in. Lisa, her heart pounding in her chest, glanced toward the exit, but the cinema doors seemed impossibly far away. They were no longer just in a movie theater, they were part of the film now. The boundaries between reality and the nightmare on the screen had blurred. The figures in the movie were no longer confined to the screen. They were in the theater, walking slowly toward the teens, their eyes fixed on their every move. The teens realized with mounting horror that the film had somehow crossed over into the real world. Ben, who had been holding onto a shred of hope that they might escape, shouted for them to run. "We can't just stand here. We need to get out. Now." But his voice was drowned out by the rising volume of the whispers and the screeching of the film. The figures in the cinema were closer now, too close. Their movements were unnatural, slow, but deliberate. They were coming for them. Mr. Reed, though clearly terrified, did not hesitate. He pulled a small, tattered book from his coat pocket. It looked ancient, its pages worn and yellowed with age. "This is the only way," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I've tried everything to stop it. I thought I could end it, but it's too strong. The cinema will never stop. It feeds on the fear, and it won't let anyone go. But this book might hold the key." The teenagers could only watch in confusion as Mr. Reed dropped the book onto the floor. As soon as it touched the ground, the cinema seemed to react. The room shook, the walls vibrating as though the very structure of the place was alive. The figures on the screen writhed in agony, their bodies twisting and contorting in ways that should not have been possible. The once still seats in the cinema began to creak, as if they were shifting, moving closer to the teens. The figures on the screen screamed, their faces contorted in pain, as though they were being pulled back into the film. The teens could feel the energy in the room shift. The coldness had turned to something more sinister, a suffocating presence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Lisa tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. It felt like the cinema itself was holding her in place, paralyzing her with its grip. For a moment, the figures stopped moving. The cinema went still, and the whispers faded. It seemed like the book had done something, but it wasn't enough. The figures in the cinema, though twisted and distorted, were still advancing. They were getting closer, and the teens could feel the terror in their bones. They were running out of time. Just as they were about to give in to the hopelessness of the situation, Mr. Reed let out a loud scream. The figures were nearly upon him now, their cold, dead hands reaching for him. "Run," he cried. "Go. You can still escape." With one final, desperate push, the teens managed to break free from the paralysis that had taken hold of them. They ran toward the door, their hearts racing, but as they reached the exit, they heard a sound, a sickening crack. Mr. Reed had been pulled toward the screen, his body jerking as though something was yanking him in. The last thing the teens saw as they burst through the door was Mr. Reed's face, twisted in horror as he was dragged into the film, his cries echoing through the cinema. The door slammed shut behind them, and the air outside felt like a breath of fresh air compared to the suffocating nightmare they had just escaped. But even as they ran into the night, the image of the cinema, dark and foreboding, stayed with them. They had escaped, at least for now. But they knew deep down that the horror of the cinema wasn't over. Not for them, and not for anyone who dared to set foot inside. The teens, still panting and breathless from their narrow escape, huddled together in the cold night air, trying to process what had just happened. The cinema was now behind them, dark and silent, but the terror they had experienced lingered in their minds, weighing on them like a heavy cloud. They couldn't shake the image of Mr. Reed, his face twisted in terror as he was dragged into the screen. The whispers that had echoed in their ears seemed to follow them, fading into the distance but never fully disappearing. They had escaped, yes, but for how long? Ben, the leader of the group, was the first to speak, his voice shaky with fear. What the hell just happened? What was that thing? That cinema, it's not normal. I don't even know what to think right now. He glanced back at the dark silhouette of the building, and for a moment it felt like the cinema was watching them, waiting for their return. His heart raced in his chest as he fought to push the thought away. "We should go to the police," Lisa suggested, her voice trembling. "They have to know about this. Maybe they can stop it." But even as she said the words, she knew they were pointless. The police would never believe them. No one would. The kind of horror they had just witnessed didn't belong in the realm of reality. It was something out of a nightmare, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. They had barely escaped with their lives, and now the last thing they wanted was to return to the place that had almost claimed them. "I don't think the police would help," Mike, the quietest of the group, said, his voice low and filled with dread. "I think we just opened something that's too big for us to stop. I'm not sure if anyone can stop it." His words sent a chill down their spines, but Mike wasn't wrong. What they had seen in the cinema wasn't just a ghost story or a cursed building, it was a living nightmare, one that seemed to feed on fear and drag anyone who got too close into its grasp. They had narrowly escaped, but how long before it came after them again? How long before the cinema reached out for them, no longer confined to its crumbling walls, but following them wherever they went? The group decided to split up for the night, each of them feeling the weight of the horrors they had just experienced. Ben stayed behind for a while, trying to get his bearings and calm his nerves. He wanted to go back to his parents' house, crawl under the covers, and pretend everything was okay, but he knew that wouldn't work. The cinema was still out there, still alive in some twisted way, and no matter how far he ran, he knew it would eventually find him again. The next day, the teens met at the local park, where they tried to piece together everything that had happened. They went over the details again and again, hoping to make sense of the nightmare they had survived. But the more they talked, the more the truth became clear. There was no explaining it. They had seen things that couldn't be explained by logic or science. The cinema wasn't just a place, it was something darker, something that had power beyond anything they could understand. It was then that Lisa suggested something that made the blood run cold in all of them. "What if we're still connected to it? What if it hasn't let us go?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through the group. What if the cinema wasn't done with them yet? What if it had already begun to claim them in some way, slowly, insidiously, without them even realizing it? The group was hesitant to believe it, but the more they thought about it, the more it made sense. The terror they had felt in the cinema wasn't just a passing moment, it had burrowed deep inside them, like an infection they couldn't shake. Ben had been having nightmares ever since, strange dreams where he was trapped inside the cinema, unable to escape. Lisa felt the cold grip of fear tighten around her chest every time she closed her eyes. Mike hadn't been able to sleep at all, his mind racing with images of the figures from the screen, their hollow eyes following him wherever he went. They were all suffering in different ways, and the realization that the cinema might still have a hold on them was enough to send a wave of panic through the group. They knew they couldn't just ignore it. If they tried to go back to their normal lives, the cinema would eventually find them again. It was patient, it would wait. And so they made a decision. They would go back to the cinema. But this time they would confront it head-on. They didn't know how or why it had this power over them, but they knew they had to end it. They couldn't keep running, couldn't keep living in fear. If the cinema wanted them, they would face it on their terms. As they made their way back to the theater, they were filled with a sense of dread that seemed to grow with every step. The building loomed in the distance, dark and silent, as if it was waiting for them. They knew what they had to do, but none of them were prepared for what they would find inside. What if there was no escape? What if they couldn't break free? But one thing was clear: they'd had no choice. They had to face whatever evil had taken hold of the cinema, or it would take everything from them. The nightmare wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The group stood at the entrance of the cinema, their hearts pounding as they stared at the dark building before them. It felt like the place had been waiting for them, its silent, oppressive presence hanging in the air. The terror that had taken hold of them the night before hadn't faded. It was still there, pulsing through their veins. Yet despite the fear that churned in their stomachs, they knew they couldn't back down. They had to face whatever was inside, whatever evil had rooted itself in the cinema, or they would never be free. Ben took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. "We can do this," he said, though his voice was far from convincing. "We have to. We can't keep running." The others nodded, but their faces were pale, their eyes haunted. They all knew that this wasn't going to be easy. They weren't just walking into a building, they were walking into a nightmare. They pushed open the door, and the familiar cold air of the cinema rushed out to meet them. It was just as they had left it the night before, silent, empty, and decaying. The seats were still in perfect rows, the air still thick with the smell of dust and neglect. But something was different now. It was darker, more oppressive, like the very walls were closing in on them. The whispers that had echoed in their minds the night before seemed to hang in the air, just out of reach but still present, like a faint, disturbing hum that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. "Do you think it's still here?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible as she glanced around nervously. The others didn't need to answer. None of them could shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to make a wrong move. They moved slowly through the aisles, each step cautious, each breath shallow. The air seemed to thicken as they walked deeper into the theater, like it was pressing in on them from all sides. The screen, once dark and empty, now flickered with a faint, static glow. It was as if the cinema itself was alive, feeding off their fear, drawing them in. Suddenly, the screen came to life, the grainy black and white footage from before flashing before their eyes. The same figures, sitting motionless in their seats, turned their heads toward the camera, their hollow eyes locking onto the teens. A chill ran down their spines as they felt the gaze of those figures pierce through them. It was like they were no longer in control of their own bodies, like the cinema was pulling them into its grip once again. Without warning, the figures in the film began to rise from their seats, just as they had the night before. But this time, something was different. The figures moved faster, more violently, as if they were eager to reach the teens. The cinema seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching across the walls like they were alive. The floor beneath their feet groaned and shifted, as if the building itself was shifting in anticipation. Mike, his eyes wide with terror, was the first to react. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, but it was too late. The figures were already advancing on them, their bodies contorting unnaturally as they crawled over the seats and down the aisles. Their eyes never left the teens, and their faces remained frozen in that same emotionless stare. The air around them grew colder and the whispers grew louder, filling their minds with disturbing images. The group turned to run, but the door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening crash. They were trapped. Panic surged through them as they realized there was no escape. The figures were closing in, their movement slow but relentless. Lisa screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the suffocating silence of the cinema. It felt like they were sinking into a nightmare from which there was no waking. But then, through the chaos, Mr. Reed's voice echoed through the theater. "You have to stop the film," he shouted. The teens turned to see him standing at the front of the theater, his face drawn and tired, his eyes filled with the same fear that had consumed him the night before. "The film is the key. You have to destroy it, or it will never stop." They didn't know how to destroy it, but the urgency in Mr. Reed's voice spurred them into action. They ran toward the VCR, their legs shaky with fear. The figures were getting closer, but they couldn't afford to hesitate. Ben grabbed the remote, and with trembling hands he pressed the stop button, but nothing happened. The film continued to play, its haunting images flashing on the screen as the figures in the theater moved closer. Panicking, Lisa grabbed the book Mr. Reed had shown them earlier, the one that had held some kind of power over the cinema. She opened it to the first page and began to read the words aloud, her voice shaky but determined. The air grew heavier as she read, and the figures froze for a moment, as if the words had some effect on them. But it wasn't enough. The figures were still moving, still closing in on them, and the cinema's oppressive grip was tightening around them. With a final, desperate cry, Ben grabbed the book from Lisa's hands and threw it toward the screen. The book hit the screen with a sharp crack, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, the screen exploded in a burst of light, and the figures vanished, their bodies disintegrating into dust as the cinema began to crumble around them. The air in the theater seemed to lift, the heavy presence that had suffocated them vanishing in an instant. The door flew open, and the teens ran out into the night, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from the adrenaline. They had escaped, but they knew that the nightmare they had just survived was one they would never forget. The cinema was no longer a threat, but the memories of what had happened there would haunt them forever. They had broken free, but a part of them would always remain trapped inside that cursed building, with the figures on the screen watching them, waiting for the next time someone would be foolish enough to walk into its darkness.